Welcome. I bid you a happy welcome to an event that we hope we will all learn from and that we will be able to better do our research for our family history. Tonight we're going to talk about probate, and it's one of the last things that happens in your life. The probate is the last word from the deceased, and it also can give you many treasures of knowledge if we find the probate file and we can look in there and we can find information about our family that we didn't have before. The learning objectives are that we want to understand that probate falls under state law and that each state governs which court serves as a repository for probate records. The reason that's important is that if it was under federal law, there would be some uniform rules for us to follow. However, because it falls under state law, the Constitution has granted the states the right to create their own laws in some of these areas, and this happens to be one of them. We want to better understand terminology used in wills and other probate documents. We want to learn to structure an efficient search for wills and other probate documentation. We want to learn to competently use indexes for wills and other probate matters. What we really want to do is understand the value of the probate estate files. I want to introduce you to a phenomenal site. If you haven't used this site, please take some time and look into it and see what wonderful things it has to offer. FamilySearch.org has this site called Learn. In this site, you can learn about probate, you can learn about land records, you can learn a lot of things about research. And it is presented in a way in which you can go back time and time again and review it so that when you make notes and you review it and you move forward and act on it, you become an expert, I promise. The Learning Center has videos and has webinars. There are lessons on probate and court records, and I heartily encourage you to take a look. The last will and testament defined. Actually, the will is, the definition of the will is simply that this is the will of the decedent. This person who is preparing the will is letting us know what it is he wants done or she wants done with his assets. It's a document by which a person regulates the rights of others over his or her property or family after his or her death. The testament, when we say last will and testament, it's my last desire, and this is my testament. The testament is the actual document, and they call it an instrument in legalese, but it's a document, and it's written, and it's a writing by which a person declares his will as to the disposal of his estate and his effects after death. Probate records are simply a way in which to prove that the will is valid. The word probate in Latin means just that. It means to prove. The authenticity of a last will and testament needs to be proven in the event that there has been some misdeed to the will since the decedent has passed. In family history, the word probate can represent a whole packet of valuable information, and we'll talk about that a little later in our presentation. The proceedings don't always start immediately. They can start as much as 30 to 90 days after the death of a person or after the reading of a will. And this this proceeding is sometimes even longer than that, and some of that will be explained later, the reasons for the delay. And it doesn't matter whether they have a will or not. If they don't have a will, they will have a probate. If they do have a will, they will have a probate. It can be a much longer time. I've seen it up to 10 and 20 years. One of the reasons for that is that they have to make sure that all of the heirs in the will have been contacted and have received the assets that were given to them and have signed or received a receipt for those assets. A primary heir or a friend of the court petitions to probate the will. This can be actually it could be a family member, it could be a good friend, it's someone that can be trusted, and it can be a verbal petition. In our day and time, most of the time it is written. These petitions are recorded only in the probate court minute books. A probate court minute book is just that. As the probate court judge deals with this particular probate, he writes, or his clerk writes, the minutes, and it's generally a short, Mr. Jones was here, and this happened, and that happened, but it's in the minute books. So when you do your research, don't forget to check the court minute books. These petitions are filed with the original estate papers. It could be the only place that all heirs are named. These original estate papers are extremely important because a file begins to be created as soon as the probate starts. And you can find a lot of information in that file, that case file, if there has been any challenge to the probate or if there have been any concerns about any of the heirs. You can find out how long it took to find Brother Daniel and where was he and all of that, if that should be your lot. Some states, not all, and remember, not all states, because it isn't a federal law, so it's not across the nation. But there are some states that require the name, age, and residence of all of the heirs. And in my history, they have, most of the states have gotten so they do that. This country's getting so large now that they have tightened up a little bit. Probate property is all the property titled in the decedent's name only. The decedent is the person who wrote the will and who is deceased. The proceeding takes place in the probate court of the county where the deceased property owner lived. Regardless of where he died, it occurs in where he lived, actually in his domicile. If the deceased also owned real estate in another state where he is not a resident, there is a process called an ancillary proceeding. And what that is, it's a proceeding that has to be done in the other location where the property resides or where it lies. It could be another state, it could be another country. And those processes have to be done before they can complete the probate. Here are some important basics. Probate courts are under state jurisdiction, and though they tend to follow general practices, laws can vary from state to state. And I know we've repeated that, but I think it's extremely important to remember that if it happens like that in Idaho, it doesn't necessarily mean it happens like that in Montana. So if you have people scattered throughout the United States, or if you go back in time, you're going to cross over state lines, and you're going to have to look and find out just what the laws are in that particular state. Each state has the right to decide which court they will keep the records in. And we are lucky here in the state of Arizona to have a probate court. However, some courts are called the Superior Court. Sometimes they house these documents in the Superior Court or maybe in their orphans court. And perhaps they have a probate court. But again, each state has a right to make that designation. As late as the 19th century, not all wills were probated. As a matter of fact, they consider that about 25% of the wills were probated. Often heirs handled the estate informally by paying off the debts. And they would sit around a table in somebody's living room and they would pay off the debts and they would divide the estate the way Grandpa wanted it done. And if it wasn't really clear, there were some laws in each state about how it could be divided if there was no will. Fewer women than men were involved in probate records because of the laws restricting ownership of property by married women. One of the things that would come into play was the dower. And don't misunderstand, this is not a dowry, this is a dower. And from 1663 to 1783, throughout marriage, a wife had a right to 1/3 of her husband's real estate. She couldn't sell it, but he couldn't sell the property without her consent. This was called a dower by common law. And common law was from England, and it was basically what was good for the common people. So they created that law. A wife's right to 1/3 of her husband's land became effective only at his death, meaning that during the marriage his control was absolute. He could sell any and all of the property. His control was called his courtesy, interestingly enough. C-U-R-T-E-S-Y, courtesy. In 1869, the dower by common law was reinstated. They did away with it for a while, but in 1869 it came back. And then it wasn't until 1960 that it was abolished. Legal documents. When you have a probate, you have legal documents. And in those documents, they have legal terms. And sometimes when we read those terms, we don't know what they mean. So we're going to help you here. A codicil is simply an amendment to a will after the will has been originally signed and witnessed. And that helps if someone makes a will and then there's another child born or a child passes away or something happens, that the testator, who is the person who creates the will or whose will it is, makes a decision that's different from what was in the original will. This way you don't have to redo the entire will, and you'll see it's just a page that is attached on the back of a will. And so if you get a will and there's several pages, read all of the pages, because that codicil is that document that'll back up the other documents. This codicil allows the testator to make valid changes without having the entire will rewritten, and that in today's economy, that is a good thing. It was a good thing back in other days also, because things did change and people changed. A decedent is simply a deceased person. So when we say decedent, we're talking about a deceased person. A testator, who is a man, or a testatrix, who is a lady, is the person writing the will. The testator or testatrix is the one whose will it is. that person may devise something. What that means is they devise, it refers to buildings and to land. When they bequeath something, it refers to personal items. A holographic will is simply a handwritten will dated by the person making it. And these are oftentimes deathbed wills. Someone is very near death and they can still write something, so they do that, and they are sometimes witnessed, but they don't have to be. A friend of the court is simply an advisor to the court who is not a party to the issue. In our case, the probate. A friend of the court is important because if you have a large estate and there is no will, you need a friend of the court who will not be biased towards any member of the family. They have to be someone who is honest and who can be a party to the issue but is not going to gain anything from the issue. There are several ways that assets can be distributed. The first one is called per stirpes. It's a method of determining who inherits the property of the deceased by specifying that each branch of the deceased person's family receives an equal share of the estate, regardless of how many people are in that branch. So, if the decedent had 5 children, and those 5 children had 5 children, they all got $1,000. And they had to divide it among their children. Contrary to that, per capita means each person weighs equally. What that means is everybody gets $1,000. But if it's per student, they have to share it. Where there's a will, there's a way. We've heard that adage, and it works really well with probate. Probate of an estate where there is a will is called testate. And if you hear that somebody died testate, that means you need to go look for a will, because that means that they had one. The person named in the will to take care of the affairs of the deceased is, as we said, the executor or the executrix. And that's how they define the men and the women. The executor or executrix must be formally approved by the court. Even if you put the name of an executor in your will, that still has to be approved by the court, because it could be that that person that you made as your executor somehow had bad times, and maybe they're not the best person right now to take care of your affairs. And so the court steps in and makes sure that your will is safe and that everything that you wanted was carried out. Occasionally, people will not identify an executor. If that's the case, the court will appoint one. An administrator is appointed and must then post bond. And bondsmen are frequently family members or friends. But the executor does not have to post bond unless the court deems that there is a challenge, and then they may have had to have posted bond. With the will, the executor files for letters of testamentary. This is simply a document that is given to an executor by the probate court, authorizing him or her to settle the estate according to the state's laws. On this document, sometimes they will put restrictions. For whatever reason, they will put some kind of a restriction. But generally, it will say no restrictions. If it says no restrictions, no bond, you don't report back like you do if there is a restriction that you do that. The executor is often, but not always, the surviving spouse. It could be the oldest child, or it could be a close relative. The executor's job is pretty ominous. They are required to ensure the best interest of the estate. They can't be partial. They have to do what is best for the estate. They have to satisfy claims of the creditors. They have to make sure all the bills are paid and all the creditors are taken care of. There is a waiting period after the probate is filed for the creditors to come forward to make their claims. The executor has to care for all property of the decedent. So if you see a vacant lot that you know is in probate, the executor needs to be the one to make sure that the grass is mowed, the weeds are up, and that sort of thing. It's a big job. They have to determine the names, ages, and addresses of all of the beneficiaries if there is a will. They need to investigate the validity of claims against the estate. There are those people who would claim that they get the farm, but the executor is responsible to making sure that that's true. They must carry out the instructions of the probate court. The validity of a will must be proven. To accomplish this, the will is presented to the court, and witnesses appear and swear that they witnessed the decedent sign the will, that the decedent sound mind at signing, that the decedent signed of his own free will. There was no coercion. He or she knew what they were doing, and that has to be proven. The court then orders the will to be recorded or declares it to be invalid. If it's invalid, it is not recorded and will not appear in the will index. But if you're lucky, it may be found in the loose papers in a court's basement. And that may seem like a strange statement, but in some of the smaller counties that I have visited and other researchers that I have known, and Gene Morgan is one of them, that occasionally they don't shred it, they just keep it because I guess they feel like somebody may need it sometime. And there have been times when those loose papers, and I don't think they're all that loose. I've seen them in binders and that sort of thing, but they're invalid documents, and you can still get information from those. Some jurisdictions, that means that states or other geographic areas, require that all of the heirs be notified and are present for the reading and the recording of the will. That has been kind of expanded a little bit in that they have times when if you lived out of the country, you have a receipt. When you receive whatever it is that the asset that has been given to you through the will, you sign a receipt for that. And those receipts go in the case file. It took 10 years for one of my second great-grandfather's probates to get finished because they couldn't find the youngest son. They finally found him in Indiana. He got to he was near, and he got to get the property that was given to him, but he had to sign a receipt, and it's because of that receipt that we knew that he was part of that family. Generally speaking, there are 3 persons that are appointed by the court to make an inventory of the estate. They just don't go willy-nilly. They have to have a formal inventory. They will have a specified amount of time to complete the inventory. It could be 90 days, it could be more, and depending on the size of the estate, they have to list all physical holdings. They have to list all debts owed to the deceased. and they have to list all allowances made for any dependents. When you talk about real property and personal property, there is a difference. Real property was buildings and anything attached to the building, any appurtenances to the building, and land. And they talk about real property, that's what they're talking about. They talk about personal property, it is furniture, it could be livestock, it could be jewelry, it could be anything of a personal nature. This estate inventory is too small for you to read, but I want you to know that I put on my special glasses today, and I was able to get some of it. The writing in here is a little difficult, but I want to help you get excited about probates and wills, and what it is a journey backwards. It's a journey back into history, and I don't know the origin of this particular estate inventory, but I want to read you some of the things that are on this inventory. One scarlet gown and a cloak, one pair of knee buckles, one tobacco box, one pair of plated spurs and a pair of knee buckles. Knee buckles must have been a big thing in those days. One new petticoat, one silk gown and petticoat, two old gowns, one chemise gown, and one cape and a remnant of silk and a pair of gloves. The remnant of silk was probably was fabric to make another piece of attire. I just thought you might be interested to know that these are the sorts of things that you can see. So someone would say, why does that matter? Well, I can just see in my mind the lady of the house in a scarlet gown and cloak. All of a sudden she lives, and she had a life, and she went places, and she had nice things. One of the things that I failed to read was a pair of old boots and a pair of shoes. Now, times were different then. They saved the old boots. They didn't take that to DI. They saved it, and they get to someone else because those things were scarce. In any case, over here to the right, in the inventory, is a value, what the value might be of these items. When appropriate, a sale or an auction is held. A lot of times they would just give things to their children, and that worked out fine too. But sometimes there was a large estate and they had things left over. So they would have an auction or a sale, and those sales are itemized and you can see them. You can see who bought the item, how much they paid for the item. And it still is very interesting. If you look at it as these are people, these are my people, and they lived, and they had books, and they loved music, or whatever it is that they have in these inventories. Many times the attendees were families and friends from the nearby buyers. Items purchased and the prices were all listed. The distribution of the estate assets needed to be made. Once that was made, then they had to sign a receipt, and each heir signed that receipt. And those receipts, like I say, are very interesting and very telling, because very often if they can't find someone, they have to wait, and then you can find out where that person was living at the time. The general information regarding children of the decedent was this: that for children under the age of 14, a guardian was appointed, and that guardian had to post a bond. For children over 14, the children were able to choose their own guardian. I don't know about you, but I've had 5 children over 14, and I don't know whether they'd have been wise in their choice of a guardian, but nonetheless, that was the law. Guardian is required to make a yearly account just like a conservator. They get money, they have an allowance for that child, and they must account for that allowance. And those are also in a binder in your court clerk's office. These recordings may be found in court records for many, many years until the child is no longer a minor. So, we talked now, we had a will and an inventory and everything. What if there is no will? Well, there's still a way. Probate of an estate where there is no will is called intestate. I've got to admit to you that for many years, I thought intestate meant that they died interstate. So if I'm looking in Ohio, that obviously that's where they died, and that is not the case. Intestate just simply means they don't have a will. The intestate rules of each state explain who will deal with the administration of the estate and who benefits from it. Each state has a schedule of who gets what when, which child. There is a schedule that they have, and they're different in each state. An administrator is appointed by the court the same as they appoint the executor or the executrix, and it's an administrator or administratrix because ladies get involved in this, and they must determine the assets and the liabilities in the estate. It's a lot of work. The document that is created for these people is called a grant of letters of administration. These letters are administered by the court, and the estate will then be administered in a way that is similar to that of a person who left a will. The monies are gathered together, and all the bills are paid. The remainder of the estate goes to those relatives who are entitled to the estate by the laws of that state. Sometimes it's the oldest son gets this, and so on. The schedule, as I said, is different. If no relatives are located, the remainder of the estate passes on to the government. Documentation that you might find in probate files. You may find a date and location of death. Be cautious about the death date when you're looking at a probate. The probate opens is not the death date. And if you can't find a death date, you can itemize that by just putting a W/PR. That just means the will was probated on that date. The given name of the deceased's spouse. That would be wonderful if you could find that. Occasionally you can learn that a wife's maiden name is available because her father was mentioned or her brother was mentioned. A listing of children and names of their spouses. Other relatives and their relationships. Places of residence of decedents and heirs. Again, when we talk about the probate files, we'll have the receipts in it. The descriptions, real and personal property that can add greatly to family histories. Once you find the description of the real estate, then you can go to land records, and in those land records, you can look at the plat and you can see exactly where your people lived. And a will, if there was one, would be in that case file also. Any codicils that were created, and they can do more than one, would be in that file. A petition for executor or administrator would be in that file. And sometimes with those petitions, they explain why they feel like they are worthy to take on this responsibility. And sometimes they will have affidavits saying that he's a good farmer and he was my friend forever and he knew John and he was a good friend and so on and he's so honest. And then we have the inventory of deceased estate at the time of death. Now you may say, what difference does it make with the inventory? Who cares if he had pots and pans and his wife had silk gowns and everything? Well, let me give you a little story. I have a third great grandfather that I'm desperate to find. And I found him, but I couldn't find anything about him. Eventually, after 7 or 8 years, I went back to Virginia, and I found that he died without a will, and in the case file was an inventory. I knew nothing about him, and I wasn't even sure that he lived there, whether he was transient or what he was, because he didn't leave a very big paper trail. In the inventory, I found farm equipment, a lot of farm equipment, big equipment. And it was in Shenandoah Valley, Virginia, which is farmland. And that made me stop and think. He was either renting or he owned land. And he had to be a farmer. He had livestock, and not just chickens. He had horses and cows, and he had established in that inventory the fact that he was a farmer who lived in that area. I intend to go back to Virginia as soon as I can, and we're going to find him. So stay tuned. He can run, but he can't hide. We'll find him. But it does give you a clue. For instance, I had a friend whose inventory had a number of Bibles and had not notebooks, but they had folios, which is simply just two sides of one piece of paper. But they had folios that had a preacher's sermons on it, and she decided he must have been a preacher. And she didn't know what religion yet, but she was looking for it. About the same time I was looking for William back there with the horses and whatnot. An inventory of the deceased estate at the time of death can be very valuable. Again, if you look at these people as people who lived, they're not just names and dates. Again, we have the receipts. And then at the end of the probate, there is a closing statement. And the court says its piece. And that's kind of interesting sometimes. I've seen some of them where the judge has kind of taken on a couple of the witnesses and felt that they hadn't come to court without being inebriated. It's been kind of interesting. Some of those old documents are fun. Now, I did bring this to show you because I'm sure that you wonder what this is. This is my genealogy disc. Just thought you'd, get a little gander at what I live with. And I'm sure yours looks the same. We're back talking about the Family Search Learn for the state and country. That is an excellent resource. This little handy book down here on the right side is amazing. If you have one of those, you can look up just about anything about any state. So you might think about that. You might try Amazon.com, and you might be able to get one for a good price. The probate records at the Family History Library catalog is very simple to use. When you're looking for probate, you always go for the place name. And we're going to look for place names in a state. Hopefully we'll know the county. You're going to find out, as you look at that, how they file and how they house their probate records. Do they put them in a box in the basement? Do they put them in Superior Court? What do they do? Then you go ahead and you select the probate records. You get the needed film or book. These documents are all on this site, FamilySearch.org. And now I want to talk just a minute about one of the greatest things that has happened to me in learned about Google. And I used Google and other kinds of research for my work and that sort of thing, but I never thought about looking for John Smith, who was born in 1723 or whatever. Don't disregard Google. And I know that if you put in there probate records, it comes up with all sorts of information. You can find resources, probate records in Alabama. It'll pop it up, and we need to make more use of the search engine. I don't own stock in that. I just happen to like it. I wanted to share it with you. Now, this is a will that was written in the original handwriting, and some of the handwriting is really difficult to read, but they did a lot of swirls and curls and whatnot, but it's wonderful to have one written in the hand of your ancestor. One of the challenges is when a will was probated, the original will stayed with the family. There was no requirement for them to file a will. So what would happen is they would have the clerk copy that will into the minute entries or the day book or one of their binders. I have a little caveat for you in that I looked for years for a grandpa whose name was Isaac Pleasant. I couldn't find him anywhere. Finally, I had a stroke of good luck, and a lady wrote a book, and I wrote to her, and she said, well, his name was William. And I thought, wow, this is great. So she had done a lot of research. Her husband was there with her. They were on sabbatical and at the Library of Congress, and they were looking at records. And she had gotten fascinated with the Pleasant name because there was a Governor Pleasant in Virginia, and she just thought it was an interesting name. In any case, they did copy my grandfather's will, and it said, I, Isaac Pleasant, which was fine because I knew his name was Isaac Pleasant. But when the clerk wrote the will, it was very short. It was a deathbed will. It was just very short. But the clerk signed it Jacob Pleasant. So when it went into the index, it went in as Jacob Pleasant. So keep in mind that when you're looking in the indexes and looking at these wills, someone else has written these wills. This is not something they have been able to file away an original will. There are times you can find original wills, and I'm going to tell you honestly, they're generally going to be from the family. Some of the families with the digitizing and everything have donated copies of those wills, and they are on the internet. But be cautious when you see something like that, because those people were humans and he did it wrong. This is a transcribed will, which is just simply somebody decided to type it. The problem with this, it's better than the handwritten will because you can read it, but you always want to copy it just exactly like it is. You don't want to change the spelling. It kind of ruins the flavor of it. So you go ahead and do it, and these little blanks right here and here are simply places that the person that transcribed this couldn't read the record. So don't try to figure out what it meant unless you can see the document, because you may have it incorrect, especially when it has to do with names. This last will and testament was from John Martin. And I thought this was worthy of our attention. He says, "To my beloved wife, Mary Martin, I give all my personal and real estate." And then he says, "My wife, Mary, to bring up my son, Henry Martin, in the fear of God, and to educate him into the ministry as he desires. All expenses to be paid from the proceeds of sale, of my properties as deemed necessary." I thought that was a very interesting statement, and this is the sort of thing, these documents are very real. When someone felt that their life was on this earth, this was many times where they put those desires of their heart, and I was glad that he had a beloved wife, and I'm sure that she took care of the son. There are some funny things that happen. You read probates and some wills. "I leave to my wife all that the law permits a man to leave. May my children always keep for their mother the tenderness she deserves." That's Louis Pasteur, and we wouldn't accept anything less than that from him because he was a great man. However, the next one, and this one we don't have a name for, it's probably just as well. It says, "I leave my sunny disposition, sense of fairness, and we were wondering how they managed to collect her neck." I just thought that was kind of interesting. The next one is, "Being of sound mind, I spent every cent while I was alive." This is the one that I'm mailing to my children. "I am busy spending your inheritance. To my son, I leave $5, should he ever demand it." Now, I kind of think that son is not in favor. Just a thought. "And then to my beloved wife, I give all." And that's a man who's very smart to do that. I thought those would be interesting. Now, if you want to take out a pen and take some of this information right here, this is a good exercise for you. Jacob D. Price, a wealthy relative who lived in Cortland County, New York, died there in 1897. Rumor has it that you were mentioned in his will. So here's a hint on how to proceed. So first you go to the Family History Library catalog, which we have at the center, and you select the place. You always start with the place. And for what? You're going to look for probate records, because if you're in his will, you want to know. For when? For the time period. And then you get the film number for the index you need. And then you use the information. Once you've found the will of an ancestor, you take time to review it in detail. And if you will take that information that I just gave you about that gentleman and practice that over at the Family Research Library, you will know how to find wills and probates. Because that is a good, we know that will is there. So we give that to you because we know it is there. Now, you answer the following questions when you get finished with all of this. Do you have a complete packet here? If not, can I obtain it? If you get a probate packet and you find references to something else in it that is not there, use your telephone. Don't be afraid to call that little clerk that is back there in Tennessee that's, sitting there with not much to do. That's her job, and she will help you. They're very kind about it. What can you tell about the family as a unit? Well, I'd say the one that had the child they were going to give the $5 to if he asked for it were in trouble, but the others were doing pretty well. We still want to know about the neck, but do any of the names mentioned sound like family names? When you're looking at the probate, you'll have all different names. You'll have people who've signed, you'll have the clerk, you'll have the judge. In small towns and small areas, there's a good chance they were related. Don't discount those names. Does the inventory tell what possessions were left behind? Yes, it does. What can you tell about the lifestyle, or community life, or finances? Well, my grandpa was a farmer. Is land mentioned? If so, have you checked land records? Did they sign the will? If they didn't sign the will, it could be that it's a deathbed will, and they didn't sign it. Were they educated? I am not sure how we find that out, but you can almost tell by their writing. And how are their feelings expressed towards other family members? Now I want to just briefly go through some glossary. And we will have a better glossary for you online. I understand we can do that, so I will make sure that we get that done. But you have to know what the words mean when you do this work that has to do with legal things. The administrator and administratrix, we've already talked about that, and that's a man and the woman, or woman who is appointed by the court when there's no will. This is in case you forget. The appointed guardian is appointed by the court. However, there are cases where the father can determine who the guardian should be, and also, well, the mother too, in the will, but they still have to be approved by the court because things change and people get sick and people move and that sort of thing. An appurtenance is simply a part of a property right. A legal right is attached to property and inherited with it. There's a barn, and it has an outbuilding with it. Well, you get the barn and the outbuilding and the corral or whatever else. Again, bequeath, personal property. Consanguinity, I'd like you to say that with gum in your mouth. That won't work. That just simply means that you're related by blood. Again, we devise real estate property. Edux and eduxor just means wife. Executor, executrix. The holographic will was a written will, and intestate was when there was no will. Movable estate is simply personal estate. This is not personality. This is personality. And that is anything that you can pick up and carry off. A non-cupative will is an oral will. There are times when there is no time to write what you want in a will. You're ill, you've had an accident, you have to do it right now, and that's an oral will. And we do have those every once in a while. Progeny simply means the descendants of a common ancestor. A relict, I was glad my husband never called me that because I thought it was an old lady. But what it is a surviving spouse, either male or female, which made me feel a lot better. Testamentary guardian, and this is one appointed by the father or the mother of a child. And the testament is simply the will of the testator. And the testate is the decedent who, it's when there is a will. Now I'm going to entertain some questions and how to use Family Search. The question is, I am a bit lost on how to use Family Search. Can I just recommend to you that you go over to the Family Research Library and take a class? It's very simple to do, and the classes are very good. You can just get on it and do familysearch.org, and it'll pop you in there, and you can just spend an afternoon just examining all the good things that you can get. But it's easy to get into, and my understanding is that they are upgrading it a lot, and they're improving it 100%. So it already has a lot of information, but it can lose you if someone doesn't help you. My recommendation is to get someone from a family history center to sit with you and show you, or have you show them, and get on the system. That's how you're going to learn it. Any other questions? Re-review, could I re-review the steps for family search? We'll crank this back up here. Whoop. They're going to fire me. I just dropped their stuff. There are two sections on these slides, and I'll take this one first. You go into familysearch.org/learn. When you get in there, just click on, click on this site right here, and it'll give you a list of the things that are available there. It's very easy. It's very user-friendly, and the way I learned about family search was I just got on and kept looking in each of the sections to see what was there. And I recommend that. If you feel like you don't want to take a class, then it's very user-friendly. I'll go back up to the other one. Here we are. Okay, again, it's the same site, familysearch.org/learn. And if you forget the backslash, just do familysearch.org, because it has the learn and some of the other titles of the information that's on there in a section where you can see it. If you want to, in this section, you can click on this, and that's where the learn is. And this is the research wiki over here, and this is about getting started with your genealogy and family history. Like I say, it is very user-friendly. What about a living will? What about a living will? A living will is something that until someone passes away, it takes care of things while you're living. And then when my husband had Alzheimer's, and he had a living will, and that meant that he could disperse things while he was still living, and it was the same as if it was a regular will. Again, on these comments, and these are good questions, just go up to Google, look at living will, and it'll show you one, and it'll tell you all how to do it. Many of those documents you can do yourself if you see the prototype on the computer. No offense to the attorneys in the crowd, but you just have to know what the laws are and that sort of thing. But if you see a living will, you can retype it and make sure that it's current. And anything else?
Would you search the same format in Wales as you do in this country? Wales specifically.
Okay, would we search the same format in Wales as we do in this country? Are they talking about family search or? Okay. They, when you go into family search, they do have it broken down with different countries. Another thing you can do is go into ancestry.com, and they are adding more and more information on foreign countries, and they're digitizing documentation that we've never been able to get before. And I haven't particularly looked at Wales, but I know that they're bringing forward a lot of Scottish records and a lot of information from Ireland. So Wales is right in there. And so again, go up to Google, do Wales family history, and see what Google brings you. You might find someone on the wiki or on the internet that has done some research there. I do want to caution you a little bit about just accepting everything someone else says unless they are officially part of a genealogical program. But it still gives you a jumping off place. You always want to research what you find that someone else has done because you don't know how thorough they are. But and it's for your own benefit. I'm sorry I'm not more versed on Wales, but I don't have any family there, and I haven't really. I just know they have a great accent. Anything else?
One more question.
Okay.
African slaves' names mentioned in wills. Are African slaves' names mentioned in wills?
Are African slaves' names mentioned in wills? Yes, they are. If you have a Southern family, especially, and it's especially true with the women in the South, that if they had slaves, they do mention them by name, and they do leave them assets, and they will say my slave Emma is to go to my daughter, and then it'll explain. Sometimes I've seen it where I have a lot of research in the South, and they'll talk about how that they are to take care of her and to make sure that she's well and all of that. Sometimes they will talk about an elderly slave that they give to one of their children or someone, and it doesn't give you last names, but it will give you the first name. They generally assume the last name of the farmer, but the owner. But they're doing much more research on that now, and I noticed the other day on the internet, it was just a little blurb that they are digitizing more of those records.